Well, thank you, Doc. Thank you, Dr. Appel. Hello, everyone. My name is Dustin Stambaugh, a doctoral candidate at California Baptist University, as you know. I want to begin by thanking my committee, Dr. Stephen Appel, committee chair, and committee members Dr. Kimberly Cox and Dr. Riste Simyan. Forgive me, Dr. Riste, Dr. Riste Simjanovsky.
It's one
Thank
of the
you.
hurdles. I apologize.
Thank you all for your guidance, insight, and support throughout this process. I'm going to present my dissertation defense titled Unraveling Disparities, Federal Infrastructure Funding Challenges for Kansas Area Municipalities. The study examines how city managers and administrators in Kansas third-class cities experience and navigate federal and state infrastructure funding systems, with a particular focus on water and wastewater systems. My interest in public service has been shaped by a lifelong commitment to helping others, informed by my faith and reinforced through professional experience. From an early age, I understood service as responsibility, showing up, reducing burdens, and helping others meet their essential needs. That commitment carried throughout my early career, 10 years of service in the U.S. Army, and ultimately my work as a city manager and city administrator in small cities. Across these roles, I became increasingly aware of how often responsibility exceeds available resources, particularly in systems that assume administrative and technical capacity that small communities do not have. This dissertation grows directly out of that experience. It examines infrastructure funding not as a question of program availability, but as an administrative and capacity-driven challenge. Specifically, the study explores how city managers and administrators in Kansas experience federal infrastructure funding systems and how institutional design, incentives, and capacity constraints shape access and outcomes. By centering the lived experiences of practitioners working in third-class cities, this research seeks to better understand why inequities persist even when funding is available, and how public systems might be designed to support more equitable and sustainable outcomes. In the fall of 2023, the city of Caney, Kansas, a third-class city of about 1,800 residents, faced the very real possibility of running out of water as prolonged drought conditions drained its primary water source, the Little Caney River. That moment made visible just how fragile essential infrastructure can be in a small community. What's essential is that Caney was not an isolated incident or had a failure of local leadership. It reflects broader structural challenges facing many small municipalities with aging infrastructure, limited fiscal capacity, and very constrained administrative resources. In Kansas, most cities serve with populations under 5,000 and are expected to maintain essential systems while navigating increasingly complex financial or funding environments designed around assumptions of surplus capacity. Understanding how city managers and administrators experience these conditions is critical to addressing persistent inequities in infrastructure funding and ensuring the long-term sustainability of water systems and small communities. The purpose of this study is to examine how city managers and administrators in Kansas experience these infrastructure funding systems in practice. Rather than evaluating the effectiveness of specific programs, the study focuses on how administrators interpret requirements, respond to constraints, and make decisions within capacity-limited environments. The study is informed by public choice theory, which provides a framework for understanding how institutional incentives, administrative capacity, and decision-making structures share outcomes long before funding decisions are made. By centering on practitioners in small cities, this research addresses a gap in the literature. It provides insight into how infrastructure funding systems operate on the ground, with implications for both policy design and professional practice. To interpret participants' experiences, this study is grounded in public choice theory. Public choice theory is valid here because it focuses on how incentives, constraints, and institutional design shape behavior within public systems. Rather than asking whether policies are well-intentioned, the theory helps explain why rational program designs can still produce unequal outcomes. As Buchanan and Tullock explain in their book or work, The Calculus of Consent, collective decision-making systems are designed to balance efficiency, accountability, and risk. In infrastructure funding, this often translates into rules meant to minimize uncertainty and prevent project failure. Applied to funding programs, these incentives rationally privilege scale and administrative capacity. Competitive applications, extensive compliance requirements, and matching fund obligations make sense from the perspective of the funding agency. However, research on administrative burden shows that these same features impose uneven learning and compliance costs. For small municipalities with limited staff, those cost functions as structural barriers as well before funding decisions are made. As Ostrom and Ostrom emphasize, inequitable outcomes can emerge without malicious intent. Public choice theory, therefore, provides a clear explanation of how incentive-driven program design stratifies access to infrastructure spending, particularly for low-capacity third-class cities. I included this diagram because I felt that it was a good illustration of how public choice theory is applicable, visually reinforcing the core idea that the same economic principles used to model consumer behavior can be applied to political decision-making. In this view, voters, elected officials, and bureaucrats act as rational, self-interested agents operating within institutional rules. The aggregate of those individual decisions, filtered through incentives, constraints, and institutional structures, produce political outcomes. This visualization helps ground our theoretical lens by illustrating that public choice theory is not about cynicism, but about rational actors within systems, which is why it's a powerful lens for understanding infrastructure funding and administrative behavior. The vulnerabilities faced by small cities in maintaining water infrastructure were brought into sharp focus by the 2023 crisis in Caney, Kansas. While acute, this event reflects broader systemic challenges documented in the literature on rural infrastructure governance. Building on the problem context, this literature review examined how existing scholarship describes the structural barriers small cities face in accessing water infrastructure funding. Across multiple bodies of work, administrative capacity and program complexity consistently emerge as central factors shaping access. Informed by the public choice framework introduced earlier, the review examines how institutional incentives and design assumptions shape administrative behavior and participation in funding systems. It situates these dynamics within the historical development of U.S. water infrastructure and the current condition of the domestic water sector. Rather than evaluating individual programs, the review synthesizes how incentives, capacity constraints, and equity implications are described across the literature. It concludes by identifying a key gap: the limited qualitative attention to the lived experiences of city managers and administrators in small municipalities, which this study addresses. Historical scholarship on U.S. infrastructure reveals a persistent tension between the promise of large-scale investments and the long-term realities of financing, maintenance, and equity. While infrastructure has often been promoted as a driver of growth, outcomes have been uneven and highly dependent on institutional design and governance. Richard White's historical work demonstrates that many major infrastructure projects failed to deliver their promised benefits over time. Early successes often mask the long-term costs of maintenance, replacement, and environmental impact. In municipal water and sewer systems, these deferred costs become visible decades later, particularly for smaller communities with limited fiscal and administrative capacity. William Childs extends this analysis by showing that public-private partnerships enable large-scale projects, but also introduced financial risk. political conflict, and uneven outcomes. Collaboration alone did not guarantee sustainability when institutional incentives were misaligned. Together, this literature shows that infrastructure outcomes are shaped as much by financing and governance choices as by engineering. This helps explain why modern funding programs emphasize procedural rigor and risk mitigation, often to the disadvantage of smaller municipalities. The contemporary U.S. water sector is widely characterized by aging infrastructure, workforce shortages, and increased financial and regulatory complexity. Many systems rely on decades-old infrastructure while simultaneously facing shortages of skilled labor needed for maintenance and upgrades. Sector analyses, including Orth's work in the Black and Veatch 2022 Water Report, note that recent federal investments, most notably the American Rescue Plan Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, have generated cautious optimism. However, the administrative complexity associated with accessing these funds remains a significant barrier, particularly for smaller cities. These challenges are especially acute for small and rural systems. Research shows that most public water systems serve small populations and operate with constrained financial, technical, and administrative resources. Even when funding and technical assistance programs exist, which we know they do, limited staffing and administrative bandwidth often restrict effective participation from smaller cities. The literature also increasingly frames water infrastructure as an ethical concern. Scholars emphasize that access to safe and reliable water is a matter of basic human dignity, and that deferred maintenance and underinvestment disproportionately affect vulnerable communities. Taken together, the scholarship depicts a water sector under significant strain. While funding opportunities have expanded, structural and administrative barriers continue to shape which communities can access and effectively use these available resources, which provides critical context of the study. Beyond infrastructure condition and financing mechanisms, the literature emphasizes the role of ideology, scarcity, and administrative capacity in shaping infrastructure funding outcomes. These factors influence not only how resources are allocated, but how funding strategies are framed, justified, and sustained politically. Research on ideology shows that funding approaches often reflect broader views of public responsibility. As Hake demonstrates, governments vary in their willingness to rely on user fees versus collective financing, an issue directly relevant to water and wastewater systems. Scarcity further intensifies these dynamics. Studies of water stress show that limited resources can heighten political incentives rather than produce purely technocratic decision-making, making funding for essential infrastructure more contested and unevenly distributed. Administrative capacity mediates how ideology and scarcity translate into outcomes. Research consistently shows that small and rural governments face persistent administrative constraints that do not diminish with time or experience. This literature demonstrates that infrastructure funding outcomes are shaped by the interaction of ideology, scarcity, and administrative capacity, again, providing a critical lens for interpreting participation in the study. The literature on domestic water infrastructure funding proposes a wide range of solutions to address aging systems and long-term sustainability. However, these approaches vary considerably in their assumptions about local governance, financial flexibility, and administrative capacity. Many scholars emphasize incremental and decentralized investment strategies. As Baird argues, gradual, local, accountable renewal can be more effective than one-time fixes. Yet, this approach assumes communities have the administrative capacity to assess system conditions, plan investments, and manage phased implementation over time. Others frame infrastructure funding primarily as a governance challenge. Coates highlights the importance of strategic financial planning, institutional preparedness, and long-term coordination. These strategies, however, depend heavily on administrative expertise and continuity that are often limited in smaller cities. System design choices further complicate proposed solutions. Research shows that centralized systems can be efficient but inflexible, while decentralized and modular approaches offer adaptability but require localized technical and governance capacity. What this shows is that there are many potential solutions, but most implicitly assume levels of administrative capacity that are unevenly distributed across smaller cities, directly informing the focus of this study. So moving on, I employed a qualitative research design using a phenomenological approach. This method was intentionally selected because the research focuses on understanding how infrastructure funding systems are actually experienced by city managers and administrators, rather than measuring program outputs or policy effectiveness abstractly. Phenomenology is well suited for this purpose because it centers on lived experience. As Mustakis describes, the goal is to understand how individuals make meaning of a phenomenon they have directly encountered. In this case, that phenomenon is navigating federal infrastructure funding within low-capacity municipal environments. The study is framed through an applied practitioner perspective grounded in public choice theory. Public choice theory offers a valuable lens for examining how incentives, self-interest, and institutional constraints influence administrative behavior. Importantly, self-interest here is not framed as misconduct, but as rational decision-making under limited time, staffing, and fiscal capacity. This framework allows the study to move beyond normative claims about how funding systems should work and instead examine how they function in real life. It recognizes that federal infrastructure programs are embedded in institutional designs that reward scale, technical capacity, and administrative bandwidth, conditions that are often absent in third-class cities. By combining phenomenology with public choice theory, the methodological framework captures both the subjective experiences of administrators and the structural incentive environment in which these experiences occur. This approach ensures that the findings are theoretically grounded, empirically rich, and directly relevant to the practice of public administration. Data for this study was collected through semi-structured, in-depth interviews with Kansas City managers and administrators who directly are responsible for infrastructure funding and implementation. A purposive sampling strategy was used to ensure that participants had firsthand experience navigating federal and state infrastructure programs. The semi-structured interview format allowed for consistency across interviews, while also providing flexibility to explore emergent themes. Interview questions focused on participants' experiences with funding access, administrative burden, training, time constraints, and decision-making under capacity limitations. Data analysis followed the phenomenological procedures outlined by Mustakis. This included epic or bracketing to acknowledge and set aside my own professional assumptions, phenomenological reduction to identify significant statements, imaginative variation to explore multiple meanings, and synthesis to distill the essence of participants' shared experiences. To ensure rigor and trustworthiness, multiple validation strategies were employed, an audit trail documented methodological decisions and analytical steps, supporting transparency and dependability. Peer debriefing was also used to challenge interpretations and reduce my own bias. Thick description was incorporated to provide sufficient contextual detail, allowing readers to assess transferability. Ethical protections were a critical component of research design. The study received IRB approval, as you know, followed informed consent protocols, and adhered to the ICMA Code of Ethics, which I am held accountable for. Participant confidentiality was also maintained through secure data storage and anonymization. Together, these methods ensured that the findings are credible, ethically sound, and firmly grounded in the lived realities of public administrators operating under constrained conditions. These research questions flow directly from the problem just outlined and intentionally focused on lived experience rather than program intent or policy design. The primary research question asks, what are the experiences of Kansas City managers and administrators in obtaining infrastructure funding, particularly grant and matching funds. This includes their interactions with major federal and state programs. The sub-questions further examine administrators' experiences with eligibility and financial constraints, access to training and preparation, and the time and administrative resources required to pursue and manage the funding. Together, these questions frame infrastructure funding as an administrative and capacity-driven challenge, establishing the foundation for the analysis that follows. Participants were city managers and administrators working in Kansas municipalities that function as third-class cities. Under Kansas statute, these cities generally have populations of 2,000 or fewer, although some municipalities remain classified third class despite them having a population change. And the city has to choose to move up, and there's a process for that. The defining feature for inclusion was not population alone, but the administrative reality of operating as a small city. These cities are overwhelmingly rural. Kansas is a predominantly rural state, and most of its municipalities serve small, dispersed populations with limited tax bases. This rural context shapes not only infrastructure needs, but also the administrative capacity available to address them. Administrators in these communities typically wear multiple roles simultaneously. Participants described managing daily operations, personnel, payroll, budgeting, compliance, and long-term infrastructure planning, often without specialized staff in grants, engineering, or finance. This context is central to the study. The experiences described by participants are inextricably linked to the administrative conditions under which they work. Understanding infrastructure funding in third-class cities, therefore, requires an understanding of the constraints imposed by limited staffing, fiscal capacity, and competing responsibilities that define small municipal governance. I just wanted to introduce you to the participants of the study. Before turning to the substantive findings, it's essential to briefly address preparation and response patterns in the study, as they are directly related to the phenomenon being examined. The study had a low participation rate, a common issue in research involving senior administrators, particularly those working in small resource-constrained municipalities. The reasons provided for non-participation were remarkably consistent. Prospective participants most frequently cited lack of time, competing operational demands, and workload pressures as reasons they would not engage in the study. Rather than treating this solely as a methodological limitation, this research interprets non-participation as an analytically meaningful phenomenon. The same structural constraints that shape administrators' ability to pursue infrastructure funding also shape their capacity to engage in optional, non-mandated activities such as academic research. From an administrative perspective, non-participation reflects rational decision-making under conditions of scarcity. When administrators operate with limited staff and time, and with high accountability demands, they must continuously prioritize tasks. Activities that do not have immediate operational consequences, regardless of their long-term value, are often deferred or declined. This decision-making pattern is consistent with the principles of public choice theory. Administrators respond to incentives and constraints embedded in their institutional environment. Participation in research offers a limited short-term payoff compared to urgent responsibilities like a water break. So such a regulatory compliance, budget management, personnel supervision, and emergency responses usually take precedent over an interview with me. The findings from this study are organized around 5 interconnected themes that emerge consistently across participant interviews. These themes should not be understood as isolated issues, but as parts of a broader system that shapes how infrastructure funding is experienced in small cities. The first theme is fragmentation. Participants described a funding landscape comprising of multiple programs, timelines, and requirements that must be navigated at the same time. The second theme, and the central finding of this study, is administrative capacity. Capacity shapes whether funding opportunities are pursued at all and influences every other theme that follows. The third theme highlights a misalignment between the design of grant systems and the realities of small cities. Many programs implicitly assume specialized staff and technical expertise that third-class cities often lack. The fourth theme captures how administrators respond to these constraints through informal collaboration, regional partnerships, and workarounds. These strategies help communities cope, but they do not resolve the underlying structural issues present. The fifth theme addresses equity and moral burden. Participants described the ethical weight of knowing infrastructure needs exist while lacking the capacity to address them. I will walk through each of these themes in more detail, using participant experiences to illustrate how they interact and shape the outcome of infrastructure funding. So the first theme that emerged from participant interviews is fragmentation within the infrastructure funding landscape. Participants consistently describe funding as spread across multiple programs and agencies rather than access to a single coordinated system. Administrators are expected to track federal, state, and sometimes regional funding opportunities simultaneously, each with its own eligibility criteria, timelines, and reporting requirements. This fragmentation creates a significant administrative and cognitive burden. Rather than focusing on infrastructure planning or system maintenance, administrators spend considerable time simply trying to understand which programs they can apply for, when the applications are due, and how requirements differ across funding sources. Several participants noted that even when funding opportunities align with local needs, the effort required to manage overlapping applications and compliance expectations often exceeds available capacity. As a result, opportunities may be delayed, partially pursued, or abandoned altogether. Significantly, fragmentation does not affect all municipalities equally. Larger jurisdictions with dedicated grant or engineering staff can absorb this complexity, while third-class cities with minimal staffing experience fragmentation as a barrier rather than a neutral feature of the system. This theme sets the stage for the following finding, which focuses on administrative capacity. The second theme and the central finding of this study is administrative capacity. Participants consistently emphasize the capacity determines not just whether funding is secured, but whether it is pursued at all. Before an application is written, administrators must determine whether they have the necessary time, staff, and expertise to engage with a funding opportunity. In third-class cities, those resources are minimal. Excuse me. Administrators described operating with minimal staff while simultaneously managing daily budgets, personnel, payroll, compliance obligations, and emergency situations. And that usually requires deprioritizing other essential responsibilities. Several participants noted that need alone is not sufficient to justify the pursuit of funding. Even when infrastructure needs are urgent, administrators must make pragmatic decisions about what is feasible given their administrative capacity. In many cases, this leads to delayed applications, partial engagement, or complete non-participation. This finding is critical because it reframes infrastructure access as an administrative issue rather than a financial one. Capacity functions as a gatekeeper, shaping which communities can realistically participate in funding systems and which cannot, regardless of their needs. The third theme that emerged from the interviews is system misalignment. Participants consistently described a disconnect between how infrastructure funding programs are designed and the administrative realities of small cities. Grant programs often assume the presence of specialized staff, such as grant writers, onboard engineers, and compliance personnel, who can manage complex applications and ongoing reporting requirements. In third-class cities, that capacity typically does not exist without outside contracts. Administrators describe working within systems that require a level of technical expertise and sustained administrative attention that exceeds what their staffing levels realistically allow. Even when programs are well-intentioned, their designs assume institutional conditions more common in larger cities. This misalignment creates a structural barrier. It is not simply that programs are complex. Instead, They are designed around assumptions that do not accurately reflect how small cities operate. As a result, administrators must either stretch limited capacity, rely on external assistance, or forego participation altogether. Importantly, this theme connects directly to the previous findings. Fragmentation increases complexity, limited capacity constrains participation, and misaligned program design institutionalizes those constraints. Together, they help explain why funding access remains uneven, even when the need is high. The fourth theme highlights how administrators respond to the constraints created by fragmentation, limited capacity, and system misalignment. Rather than disengaging entirely, participants described a range of adaptive strategies used to navigate infrastructure funding systems. A common strategy involved reliance on informal networks and personal relationships. Administrators often turn to colleagues in neighboring communities, regional partners, consultants, listservs, and state agency contacts to help interpret requirements, identify opportunities, or troubleshoot their application. Participants also described forming regional partnerships or pursuing shared services when possible. These arrangements allowed cities to pool limited capacity, share expertise, or jointly pursue funding opportunities that would otherwise be unattainable. While these strategies do demonstrate resilience and professional ingenuity, participants were clear that they function as workarounds rather than solutions. Informal collaboration heavily depends on personal relationships, regional luck, and timing, resulting in uneven and unpredictable access. This theme is central because it shows that inequitable outcomes are not the result of inaction or apathy. Administrators are actively adapting to system constraints. However, these adaptations do not eliminate the underlying structural barriers embedded in the funding design. The fifth theme explores the ethical and moral aspects of infrastructure funding as perceived by city managers and administrators. Participants described the ethical stress associated with making prioritization decisions in the face of limited capacity and constrained access to funding. Administrators are often fully aware of the deteriorating infrastructure needs, but must decide which projects to pursue, delay, or abandon based not only on urgency, but also on what is administratively feasible. Several participants spoke about the long-term consequences of deferred decisions. Aging water and wastewater systems do not simply cease to function, they just continue to deteriorate, increase risks to public health, environmental quality, and community stability. Administrators described carrying the weight of these deferred risks, even when it was beyond their immediate control. Notably, this theme reconfigures how equity is perceived at the local level. For participants, equity was not defined solely by who ultimately receives funding, but by whether communities have a fair opportunity to participate in the funding process in the first place. When access to the process is constrained by administrative capacity, and equity becomes embedded long before allocation decisions are made. This theme underscores the human dimension of infrastructure governance. Behind program requirements and funding formulas are administrators making consequential decisions with limited options and significant moral responsibility. Taken together, these five themes suggest that infrastructure outcomes in small municipalities are shaped by institutional design rather than local intent and effort. Fragmentation, limited capacity, and system misalignment interact in ways that predictably advantage jurisdictions with greater administrative resources. Across the findings, administrative capacity consistently functions as a gatekeeper. Capacity determines whether funding opportunities are identified, whether applications are submitted, and whether projects can be managed through compliance and reporting requirements. In this way, capacity shapes participation long before decisions are made. Importantly, the findings suggest that inequity is structural rather than individual. Participants did not describe disengagement or lack of awareness. Instead, they describe rational decision-making under constraint. This interpretation aligns with the study's theoretical framework. From a public choice perspective, funding systems reflect rational incentives and risk management strategies. However, these same incentives produce uneven access when administrative capacity is unevenly distributed. Understanding inequity at this level shifts the conversation away from blame toward the design of institutions. So, implications for policy and practice. First, the findings suggest that infrastructure funding programs should more explicitly account for differences in administrative capacity. Current designs often assume a baseline level of staffing, technical expertise, and time that does not exist in many small cities. Second, participants' experiences point to the value of simplification and coordination. Fragmented programs with overlapping requirements increase administrative burden without necessarily improving accountability. Streamlining applications, aligning timelines, or coordinating reporting requirements could reduce these barriers. Third, the findings highlight the importance of shared technical assistance. Many administrators describe benefiting from regional support, state agency guidance, and informal networks. Expanding structured shared technical aid rather than relying on ad hoc relationships could help level the playing field for smaller cities. Importantly, these implications do not call for reducing oversight or eliminating competition. Instead, they suggest that equity and infrastructure funding depends on designing systems that provide all communities with a realistic opportunity to participate, regardless of their size or administrative capacity. Across interviews, city managers and administrators consistently described infrastructure funding systems as fragmented, complex, and administratively demanding. Access was shaped by the severity of infrastructure need and more by whether a municipality had sufficient administrative bandwidth to pursue and manage funding. Participants acknowledged that grant training and technical assistance were available, but time and staffing constraints often prevented them from taking advantage of these opportunities. Significantly, the same restrictions that limit funding access also limit participation in this research, reinforcing the central role of capacity. These findings demonstrate that infrastructure inequity is not merely about the availability of funds, but who has the administrative capacity to access them. This study makes significant contributions to the literature in several important ways. First, it empirically demonstrates that administrative capacity functions as a gatekeeping mechanism across multiple domains. Not only access to infrastructure funding, but also participation in training, professional engagement, and research itself. Second, the study reframes non-participation as analytically meaningful rather than a methodological flaw. The absence of voices reflects the same structural constraints examined in the study. Third, this research extends public choice theory beyond abstract policy design to the lived realities of local administrators, showing how incentive structures and scarcity shape behavior and practice. Ultimately, by employing a phenomenological approach, the study provides qualitative depth to discussion of infrastructure equity, highlighting how inequities are experienced rather than just measuring it. As with all qualitative research, the study has clear and intentional boundaries that shape the interpretation of its findings. First, the findings are grounded in the institutional, legal, and administrative context of Kansas. State-specific funding structures, statutory requirements, specific funding structures, and intergovernmental relationships influence how infrastructure programs operate. While many of the challenges identified, particularly those related to administrative capacity, are likely familiar in other states, the results are not intended to be universally generalizable without consideration of the local context. Second, the study reflects the realities of small, capacity-constrained municipalities. In third-class cities, administrative responsibilities are concentrated among a minimum number of individuals who simultaneously manage operations, compliance, budgeting, and long-term planning. This concentration influences both how infrastructure funding is pursued and the amount of discretionary time administrators have for activities beyond core operations. A related implementation is the study's participation and response rate. Several potential participants were unable to engage due to workload demands and time constraints. While this limited the sample size, it also reflects the very conditions the study examines. The same capacity constraints that affect access to infrastructure funding also restrict participation in voluntary studies. Rather than undermining the study, this limitation reinforces its central argument. Administrative capacity functions as a structural gatekeeper. Finally, consistent with phenomenological design, this study does not seek statistical generalizability. Instead, it prioritizes depth, lived experience, and contextual understanding. These limitations are transparent, theoretically aligned, and appropriate for the research questions guiding the study. For further research, one clear opportunity is comparative work. Further studies could examine whether the capacity constraints identified in Kansas, third-class cities, are replicated in other states, particularly those classification systems or quantitative research outcomes at a broader scale. And expertise or institutional support predicts success in competitive infrastructure programs. A second area for future research involves what the study identifies as rational non-participation. Several administrators effectively opted out of funding opportunities, not due to the lack of need, but because the administrative burden outweighed the perceived likelihood of success. Examining non-application as a rational administrative strategy rather than as a failure could significantly advance scholarship on administrative burden and public choice dynamics in small cities. From a policy perspective, the findings suggest that improving infrastructure equity requires more than increasing funding levels. It requires institutional alignment between program design and local administrative reality. One promising example already emerging in Kansas is the Kansas Infrastructure Hub, which serves as a centralized coordination point for technical assistance, funding, navigation, and interagency support. Rather than expecting every city to master these complex federal programs independently, the hub represents a shift towards shared capacity and intermediary governance. Chapter 5 argues that this type of model, regionalized, capacity sensitive, and administratively supportive, may be more effective than continued reliance on competitive, compliance-heavy funding structures. Expanding shared grant services, regional technical assistance, and tiered program requirements could reduce structural exclusion without sacrificing accountability. Ultimately, this research suggests that infrastructure equity is not primarily a funding problem. It is a capacity problem. Addressing the gap requires both continued empirical research and deliberate policy experimentation that acknowledges how small cities actually operate. So I'll close with this central takeaway. Infrastructure inequity is often framed as a problem of insufficient funding. This research demonstrates that inequity persists even when funding is available because access to those funds is usually mediated by administrative capacity. When policy designs assume levels of time, staffing, and technical expertise that small municipalities often lack, inequity becomes structural rather than accidental. In such cases, the issue is not a lack of motivation or need, but rather a misalignment between institutional design and administrative reality. Addressing this gap requires more than additional dollars. It requires rethinking how infrastructure programs are structured, supported, and administered, particularly for small, resource-constrained communities. Just in case you're interested in the references I used in the making of this presentation, thank you. I am happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Dustin. Appreciate the presentation. At this time, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions from the committee members. I'll let you ask as many as you'd like. I'll go ahead and wrap up the Q&A portion, but I'll open the floor to either one of the committee members.
I have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. I appreciated the background on the city structure in Kansas. Being in California, I'm not familiar with the hierarchy of, first, second, third class cities. So I felt that was very, very helpful to your study. I love the selection of the public choice theory. I thought that was an excellent lens for you to complete your evaluation. And then before I get into my questions, thirdly, I really appreciate in your concluding remarks how you characterize it, and I'll quote, what emerged from the findings is not a story of disengagement, mismanagement, or lack of professionalism. Instead, it is a portrait of public servants operating within a system that consistently demand more capacity than small municipalities can realistically supply. And that is a tremendous statement that really embodies this whole work. Um, so now on to my two questions. The elephant in the room is the small sample size, the small respondent size, and you thoroughly acknowledge that, and you actually parlay that into an aha moment, one of your findings as you extrapolate as to why that is. But I'm curious on, when you saw the limitations in these managers being able to participate, how did you deal with it? Did you call them? Was it email communication only? What did you do to perhaps solicit greater participation?
I tried to divide the cities because I was targeting city managers and city administrators initially. I tried doing all three methodologies with cities above 1,000. Um, and I tried calling. There was a couple that asked me to call them back. I called them back. They ghosted me. There was a lot of people who thought that I was there was the entertaining part is some people thought it was spam. I had all sorts of responses. I think one thing that I can do better moving forward in hindsight is I was probably driving. I think one thing I learned is instead of relying on electronic means of communication via telephone, via text, or via email, which is how I did the cities below 1,000 people. I probably will have to drive because of what I've learned about administrative capacity. I also think that's a lot of the reason why the state of Kansas had trouble gathering information and why maybe their numbers and allocation strategies at the state budget level were uneven too. That was a thought I had was they probably have just as many challenges getting a hold of these city clerks because a lot of times city administrators don't serve in cities below 1 to 2,000 people. Uh,
Hmm.
so a lot of times it's just a city clerk, and I reflected that in the data. So there's probably a lot of ways that I can probably do better to try to increase the amount of participation so we can get the information we need to get them the resources that they need or possibly do a better study, better allocation of resources, etc.
Okay. And if you were to do this over again, is there a different approach you would take to the study? Because this would be, I think, a great study for a quantitative approach, looking at the dollars received by these smaller cities. But any thoughts on what you might have done differently?
I think that quantitative would have been easier because at least the budgets and what they get allocated is all public information. So it would be a lot easier for me to gather data than people's experiences navigating the system. But yeah, I would love to do a quantitative study. I think that would provide a lot more concrete information to either bolster my thoughts or add some clarity to what I'm observing or listening to.
Good. Well, thank you. That's all I had, Steve.
Okay, if I go?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, you can see and hear me okay. Dustin, I really enjoyed that. There's a couple of things I like about this study. I enjoyed the
Thanks.
topic when I got to see the topic of it, just in general, the headline of it. Um, I I think the group already knows that I sit on CBU's IRB, and so I get to see a lot of the. I really like the way that this methods was set up.
Thank you.
Regardless of the participants and that kind of stuff, that's a whole other world. But the way that it was framed and designed, I just want to give a tip of the hat to you, Dustin, and also to Dr. Appel. I thought it was wonderful. I think the takeaway for me was that this was such a unique take, right? We are so bombarded with we don't have the funds. That's why we don't have the money. If we had more money, we'd hire more staff. We'd have blah, blah, and that's but it's like it's almost we're just so bombarded with this that it's almost numbing. So I appreciate having this unique take. The question I have is, let's fast forward 5 years. Let's take a look at how robust artificial intelligence has become. The fact that I can take my blueprints for my wife's office, a dental office, and pop them in there, and within 15, 20 seconds, I have a list of questions that I can send to the city. How do you think that artificial intelligence now, with your understanding of what this capacity looks like, does that enable some of the folks that are there? Is it fearful? Do they need to have specific AI software? Do they turn their backs to it? What do you think? How do you think that looks in your industry in the next 5, 10 years?
That's a study in and of itself. And if you've looked at my LinkedIn discussions, I'm engaged in debate with a lot of my colleagues over how artificial intelligence is going to apply to our future operations. My experience with artificial intelligence has been a mixed bag. I think that it'll do it if it's used well, like any other tool, like a New York Times, or any other tool. You can either use it to augment your understanding of things. So that artificial intelligence could be used but by constituents or by city clerks to enable them to do research and be able to do funding and grant applications and all that stuff. I've seen a lot of presentations at conferences where that's being implemented. The challenge I've had is that not in any of the cities I've served. A lot of the cities that I work at, in the city of Weed, I've just updated our website and I just added a Facebook page. And Facebook is so 5 years ago for a lot of people. They've got 20 plus social media platforms now. So I think that when it's implemented well, I think this could be a topic that could really help them out. But a lot of the people that I talk to are very intelligent, very good at city operations, but are not even, I don't even know that they're even using artificial intelligence right now. And if they are using it, are they using it to augment their ability, or are they one of those folks that do it for, I just finished some courses on artificial intelligence and large language models specifically, so I can figure out how to implement them in cities. And it's such a vast expanse of knowledge that I don't know how to answer your question succinctly without diving into a whole new study in and of itself. So 5 years from now, as fast as it's going, I don't know.
Yeah. I would agree. I think that it's one of those it's a known unknown. Does that make sense? It's
Yes.
something that we know that something's going to change. We just don't know how it's going to change. The one thing I will say, and I'll kind of throw it in there, and then I'll get to my next question. I think there's this assumption in my head of what a typical manager might do, which is, here is the software, use this software to complete this work. I think the bigger, more intelligent thing might be, let's go backwards a little bit and find the folks that are actually receiving these applications and have them apply artificial intelligence when the applications are coming in, that those are being modified on the fly. Meaning, I submit my information and it gives me a questionnaire of things about my city. And then slowly that application modifies itself and provides questions to the folks providing it feedback. I think that is a more dynamic way of doing this. I don't think that it will happen because it requires work on the back end from folks that are already receiving the applications. So what it does is it enables these smaller municipalities, these lower tier folks. I don't even like using that term, but the lower tier communities, right? That they're ranked lower for a variety of reasons. it gives them an equal playing field. And it provides the system that they need to be able to submit applications. But I don't know where that comes from. Does that come from their side going, we want to support you. We want this to look. So that's that part. The second part, Dr. Cox really kind of you stole a bunch of my questions, so I appreciate that. But the secondary data I think is really important as well. Later on, when you're far down your career and you're already kind of you're getting bored with research topics, I think being able to layer and maybe find a way to triangulate what secondary data looks like, and then the size and specific organizations and who is being efficient would be really cool. Because it would be able to say, hey, this organization with only this many people is doing this at this level versus, yeah, here's this city, but they've got, they're serving 17 million people or whatever it is, 30,000 people, 300,000 people, whatever the number is. And they have this massive staff. So I'll just leave it with that. It's not a question so much as just kind of put a overall to the team. I really enjoyed this study. So I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Any further questions? Nope. Dustin, I had a couple. I appreciate the presentation. Great work. I had the fortunate opportunity to work with you from the very beginning and see how your proposal has changed in certain ways, and I appreciate that. And even before the committee members had the opportunity to for their first read on it, we worked through some challenges, and I appreciate your reception to that. That was great. Diving into it and kind of, I don't want to beat the dead horse, but going back to what Dr. Cox said about the elephant in the room with the low sample rate. In your methodology chapter, you talked about theoretical saturation. With the low participation rate, do you believe that you reached any sort of theoretical saturation with the responses to your questions?
To piggyback what Dr. Apple, thanks for the question. To piggyback what I told Dr. Cox, I don't want to commit to that because I think hindsight's 2020, like I told her. I think that there's probably what I've learned from this is because there's administrative capacity constraints with just electronic communication with all the spam out there. I think planning a road trip as part of my data collection phase should be a part of the work that goes into this. I mean, we know that from census studies, every 10 years, we send an army of a proverbial army of workers out there to gather an accurate count of every single person that lives within our borders. So I think that to truly be able to gauge whether there's a theoretical saturation or not, I think that would be something knowing what I know now, would be something I would do differently so that I could feel comfortable answering your question.
Okay.
I'm not confident that I've reached saturation because there's limitations to the electronic communication piece. I feel confident in my answers. I know that there's administrative capacity constraints, but I don't feel confident that I've reached theoretical saturation. I would like to experiment, maybe if I had the opportunity to do it again. Hope not this time, please. But future in my career, I would add that step to really feel confident in my answer.
Okay. I had another question. Did that lack of responsiveness surprise you?
A little bit. I'll be honest, when I first started this process, I thought I was underestimating the amount of people that were going to respond. So yeah, it was a little surprising. I have definitely evolved or grown and learned through this process about all the fun that researchers have on an everyday basis, and now I can relate with a lot of the things I've read about and the frustrations and the experiences, and yeah, it did surprise me.
Okay. Okay. Any follow-up questions from the committee members at this point?
Well,
Okay.
I know our time is getting short, but did the managers that you spoke with have any thoughts on how to reduce these barriers that you've identified?
It depended on who I talked to. One of the limitations that I had going back to the AI thing and what you heard in my AI question and what you heard in my answers is there at some of some of the first interviews, these city clerks are barely able to keep up with the day-to-day operations of stuff. So to expect them to reach out to to higher levels of thinking was a challenge. The ones that did have the capacity to talk to me about that is exactly what I mentioned in my solutions already is they're the to simplify the process. There are a lot of people who I talked to later who were happy about the Kansas Infrastructure Hub. So I know that I'm not the only one who's been reporting on this phenomenon. And so I was a little disappointed because it kind of took the wind out of my sails on some of the points I was making with their program because it actually was a pretty direct answer. I would love to re-interview them again to see where they're at after the Kansas Infrastructure Hub was in full swing to see how effective it was. But yeah, the solutions that they have is to make it easier and more streamlined. That's probably one of the because a lot of times they have to rely the cities have to shell out exorbitant amounts of money for people like Dr. Appel. I'm joking, but to come and advise them for engineering services, and a lot of these cities just don't have the cash without raising rates, and a lot of these administrators have to work with their councils to balance how much they can bill their water customers. A lot of them are seniors. A lot of them are working class folks. And so having the state help out with some of that is probably going to be a big help. That's why I would love to see a follow-up study in Kansas in particular to see how much of an impact that has and to see if that how the opinions of these interviewees change as they interact with this program that Kansas has.
Okay. Well, I think we've reached the point where we're going to ask you to exit out of the Zoom call. And once we deliberate, I will send you a text and then you can rejoin the conference here.
Well, thank you all. It has been an honor, and I look forward to talking to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Well, after much deliberation and on behalf of the committee, it's my honor to congratulate you on your successful dissertation defense, Dr. Stambaugh.
Thank you, Dr. Apple, Dr. Cox, and Dr.
Dr.
Sim,
S. Dr.
Sim,
S. Don't do it.
Dr.
My wife
S.
didn't take it. Don't you do it.
I appreciate you all very much.
And yeah, your hard work is definitely recognized and it's obvious. So now you can go out and enjoy your accomplishment.
Thank you.
I will